most Q&As that filmmakers do for their films tend to center on the topic of the film. And my guess is that when you do normal Q&As after your screenings, a lot of people are talking about the situation in the Amazon and in these communities and saving the rainforest. But we're a bunch of filmmakers, and what we do with these case studies is we really get into the weeds and nuts and bolts of how the film came about. Where you got the idea, how you proceeded, where you got the funding, all those sorts of things. And I'll moderate the first half just to throw some questions, and then we'll turn it over to all you guys to ask your own questions and make comments or whatever in the second half. So I want to lead off by just Alex and Will, I noticed on the website that you guys both studied environmental science at McGill. Is that where you met up, and is that sort of the acorn of where this idea grew out of to make this film? I mean, that was like 10 years ago, right?
It was way further back than that, Doug. Will and I were neighbors growing up in Ithaca, New York. And so we've known each other since fifth grade when Will moved into our school district. And, he was a hot shot in fifth grade, and I was a little intimidated. We didn't become friends until middle school, a couple of years later, when I finally became cool enough for him. But we haven't stopped working together ever since. We went to school together in Montreal and lived together and worked together for a while in Nairobi, and studied environmental science together. And I think, a lot of the things that we're interested in exploring through film come from, I think, that sort of shared identity and the relationship we had with the natural world growing up, and then studying it academically in school.
So this isn't the first project, obviously, you worked on together. But you were the first. I mean, Will, you were sort of the first. Who had the idea? I mean, how did this come into being?
The original idea for this came from just reading about Nadine and her work. I had found her online, just kind of reading about the situation in Brazil, about the presidential elections that were coming up then in 2018. We were seeing this really horrific, violent rhetoric coming out of Bolsonaro's campaign saying, I'm going to do away with indigenous territory. There's not going to be any, they called himself the chainsaw candidate. That was his name for himself. And so I had read about Nadine, the activist in the film, and her work defending the rainforest and indigenous rights, and just sent her an email, kind of old school, saying, hey, I love your work. I think you're incredibly inspiring. Your life is about to become really difficult if this guy wins the election. Could I come and meet you? And so Will and I and another friend all pitched in like $1,000 to give me a $3,000 grant from ourselves to go down to Brazil and meet Nadine and begin filming. And it all just sort of began really quickly from there. I think we realized it's a bigger story than we originally thought.
So you started with an interview of her, or followed her around for a few days, or how quickly did she kind of buy into the idea of this dude coming down with his camera and nosing around?
Everybody's rightfully very skeptical to start. I think like Nadine and a lot of people there had had bad experiences with journalists in the past and felt like people came in and out and didn't really change much in terms of their situation. It actually took a lot of their time. They called it like babysitting journalists, where you go and spend 2 weeks and you show them all the deforestation sites and they interview all the right people, and then they leave for their different respective outlets. And especially given the way that American culture has been built on the expropriation of native land here in the United States, there was this real skepticism of me as an American coming in and trying to do something that was looking at deforestation and native rights in the Amazon. And so Nadine really she says she tested me. I didn't know it was a test at the time, but she took me out on these missions and tried to sort of see how we would behave. And I remember when Will came to the Amazon too, for the first trip that summer, the Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau, the indigenous community in the film, afterwards they said that was a test and you guys did really well, but they took us out for a sort of multi-day boat journey, and I think that was part of their way of seeing whether we were in it for the right reasons and whether we could keep up and whether we were gonna leave when things got a little more difficult.
I should also just mention another huge component of this was Gabriel, the other Gabriel Chiba, who's also a producer on the film. And for a long time, we were kind of the three in the primary sort of in production. And he's a photojournalist from Sao Paulo, but who had relocated and spent years and years in the Amazon and knew Virginia well, was working with her, and knew the Uru-Eu-Wau super well, as professionally, but also as a friend. And it was really like as a team that we sort of came to the community and came to her, and we couldn't have possibly done it without him. So I just want to give him. Unfortunately, he can't join today because he's with the incumbent, with the president-elect Lula, and he's and meeting with them. So he sends his best.
It's a pretty good excuse. Okay. So I really want to follow up on this because so many of our filmmakers, it's like, how do we get the footage to even show funders, get enough footage to show that we're on the right track of a story? So Alex, in this first trip, did you go down, you went down alone for a while? Did you shoot as a one-person crew and gather some stuff? And then you and Gabriel joined up maybe, a couple of months later?
Gabriel was there from the very beginning.
Okay.
As soon as I sent the email to Nadine saying, "Hey, I love your work," she responded with Gabriel on CC and said, you can't work here and with me unless Gabriel's involved. Like that's point one. And it's true. Nothing happens there without Gabriel's involvement. But that first trip, and then Will came. The deforestation in the Amazon follows a seasonality. So, the dry season is when everything dries out, roads are passable. There's a lot more invasions. There's this flurry of activity, and that's when the fires come as well. And so first trips were in the wet season. And so it's, more politically focused, looking at this transition of power, Bolsonaro taking over. What does that mean? And that was me and Gabriel with zero budget. So we just said, look, Nadine, we'll go wherever you go. We'll ride in the back of your car, throw us in the trunk. It doesn't matter. And we just want to be there with you through everything. And promise we're not going to get in the way.
Gabriel was on sound?
No, I ran all the sound straight into my camera. Gabriel was really like field producing, managing, translating, everything. And that trip was focused on Nadinia. And through that trip, realized, okay, Nadinia's life is really centered around protecting this huge indigenous territory, the Uru-Eu-Wau. Maybe that's going to become part of the story. And then subsequent trips really kind of grew the story to include their perspective and everything.
So, Will, how were you getting footage while they were out doing this? Were they sending any stuff back to you, or did you just go down at some point to see what was going on, or what? How did you enter the fray?
Yeah, I mean, I joined shortly thereafter. I wasn't there for the very first trip, but that very first trip also included a couple of key scenes that even made it into the film. And so Alex came back. We had a little office together in New York, and we were cutting development, little scenes and trying to show it to people. And early in 2019, Alex participated in what was then called IFP Week, which is now the Gotham. And so we were trying to hustle. That was like our first deadline to have some stuff to show. And that's where we started. We did all those meat market sort of speed dating things because we were first-time feature filmmakers. We've been working on shorts and doing a lot of journalism work, but didn't know exactly how to crack into the features world. No idea how to finance a film. And for a while, it was me, Alex, Gabriel. None of us had made a film. And that's where Alex met the team at Producer, which is Darren Aronofsky's company. And very early on, then they were impressed with some of the stuff, invited Alex to come to their office and scrub through just like dailies and just have a look at what's there. And it was from that first development shoot sort of material that Darren came on and put a huge sort of creative, you just put a lot of, you just encouraged us to be more ambitious and think through so many other aspects and layers of the filmmaking, and think of it honestly, how we would tell a story if we, if we could, not exactly in the same way as a narrative, but thinking about storytelling in a much more ambitious way than just sort of show
like if money were no object.
Yeah, and obviously money was an object, but that put a lot of creative challenges to us that I think helped us just push on. And so yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I know Sigrid told me she had to go off for a phone call for a while, so I'll bring her in when she returns. But and how she came aboard. But take us through those meetings. Like, what did you haven't made a film yet? I mean, a feature together. So it's the first time you're trying to get money. What did you show there in those meetings? How long did you have? Because they never watch those things in advance, right? So there you are at the meetings and you have to show them something. How long was your sample? It couldn't have told the whole story, obviously. You only have a little piece of it. How did you pitch it there?
It was tricky. We went back and forth, like, I think the problem we ran into a lot in the beginning was trying to trailerify everything too much and, try to tell the whole story in 2 minutes or something like that. And then get in all the tone, but then it ends up feeling like a lot of moody tonal footage, but doesn't really have the elements of a story. And so for a lot of those meetings, we had like a 2.5 minute reel. I didn't want to show more than that because I wanted to be able to talk for pretty long. And I would bring like a big notebook with me, like almost newsprint sized, and would use that to draw like, okay, here's the territory, here's this, and kind of like visually map stuff out sitting at the table with somebody. But I think what we landed on that was best eventually, and it was after some of these meetings, unfortunately, or through the help of the people that we met at these meetings rather, was like a 7-minute thing that had a minute and a half of like, this is the tone, this is the style that we're going for at the top, and then had 3 just distinct scenes that we kind of let run, where you got to know the characters, but they had conflict within the scene and didn't give you the story at all, but gave you a sense of like who these people are and what they're after. I think that was our Goldilocks trailer, I think, in the end.
Yeah.
I think what we were able to articulate was that we had a contained conflict between 2 groups, not who are theoretically in conflict with each other, but who are literally, one is the arch nemesis of the other, and we have deep access to both. And we see this as a window into a much bigger phenomenon that's happening all across the Amazon and affects us all. So it was a very contained story that could be told as a human drama, but that had this bigger context. And I think just, once we'd secure that access, we really focused on how we saw both sides navigating this conflict, but obviously we always didn't know where it was going to go either.
So when you had those meetings, had you already been in touch with Sergio, right? Is his name the head of the Farmers Association?
Yeah. By the time we started those meetings, we were filming with the Association of Great So it followed a couple different members. Like, one of the leaders was arrested and went into hiding. One of them was arrested. The other one went into hiding, and we'd been filming with them before. And then Sergio sort of ascended in that new vacuum of power. So there was, a couple trade-offs in terms of who we were following during the course of production, but we were in touch with them pretty early.
The funny thing, the really lovely thing was when we got into Sundance, Catapult Film Fund, who had given us a very early grant, did this very nice thing where they sent us back our original application. and just as a kind of reminder of the journey that we've been on, and said, congratulations, have a look at where you've come from. And in that, we really had the film as it is, but it was the precursor to Bitate. It was the president of the Uru-Eu-Wau Association before him, and it was the president of the Association Rio Bonito before Sergio. And so we had, in some ways, we saw like both of the two people who become the main, protagonists, antagonists of the film. We were able to see their entire arc because we were actually there when they even sort of took power. And so, we were there from the beginning of their leadership. And so we kind of saw that all the way through, if that makes sense.
When you had those meetings, did the funders give you, like, in the sense, the big question, like, where do you see this ending? Like, how could you answer that question if they were, you set up the conflict, but it's hard to know how it will resolve itself. I mean, you kind of get a sense, but you don't really know. And you can't foresee certain elements, obviously. I don't know how you felt about it, Alex, but I really always assumed that the land grab would work out. I really kind of thought that we would end, the film would end, and they'd be building a church and a school, and that would be kind of the story of how the Amazon gets transformed from rainforest, old growth rainforest, into pasture. And it seemed like a really intense situation that I couldn't imagine how the indigenous community was gonna fight back and win. And obviously couldn't have anticipated Bitate's leadership, couldn't have anticipated COVID and how he was able to kind of turn that from a challenge into an opportunity. But I think for a long time, I thought it was just going to be a darker ending, honestly.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we did anticipate that made it easier for funders to give us some freedom was that we did have a time frame. Like we said, when a lot of these meetings were happening, it was 2019, and I don't know if people remember, but the Sao Paulo had gone black with smoke from the Amazon. And it was that summer that it really blew up internationally. The story of the Amazon is burning, Bolsonaro's in power now, holy shit. And the fact that we had been filming since before Bolsonaro came into power, and had a bit of that transformation. And then the fact that we were pretty clear in these meetings that we want to finish this film before Bolsonaro's term is up, so that we can release it before this upcoming election. He'll be up for re-election in 4 years. We've been filming for a year or whatever it is at that point that the meeting's taking place. And so we have a theoretical ending. Maybe we blow past it if we need to, but there is a time scale on which a funder can wrap their head around. And also gives the release, it's pegged to something without being an overtly political film. It has a sort of news peg with when we're planning on releasing it. And then luckily we were able to get it done and released it in Brazil in theaters just 3 weeks before people went to the polls. And so that thankfully all worked out.
So at what point did you, well, let's talk about your relationship with the community, with the indigenous community. And I don't want to bungle the name, but Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau? Is that close enough? Is that like in the ballpark? Okay.
Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau.
Okay, I have to say it fast and then it'll like be better. Was their participation on the level that it became out of necessity, or was it, did you kind of think of it from the beginning that it might go that way, or did COVID kind of drive it? Did they take did they take this kernel of an idea and really run with it even more than maybe you expected? Let's talk about that, because we've actually done a lot of talking recently about the relationship between filmmaker and participant, and you guys kind of took it to a new level, or a different level.
It's a really good question, and it can become a kind of long answer. So just cut me off, Will.
No, go for it. We still have time.
It's hard to sort of parse out, because Will and I both worked in participatory film before this, I had worked building an environmental curriculum for, the environmental film curriculum for kids in the Philippines. Will and I had done workshops for lawyers and human rights activists in Somalia who want to incorporate video and film into their work. And so we're thinking a lot. We have been thinking a lot generally about participatory film and having everybody pick up a camera and the power of that. We both like teaching. Both of Will and I have, school teacher parents. And so it's in the back of our minds all the time. And I think when we first met the Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau, it was really obvious that there was a lot of work that we needed to do to teach a bit about documentary, to explain what documentary is before we could even ask permission to embark on this with them. The elders in this community had never seen a feature film before. So how do you ask somebody if they want to be part of it if they don't know what it is? The way that we approached that was just bringing some extra cameras and really informally, not with the expectation that we're ever going to use any of this footage, but just to open up the process and say, here's a camera, here's how it works. Like, this is what I'm pointing at you. Point the camera at me, ask me about my life in New York, ask me why I'm making this film. Like, let's spread this out a little bit. And through that, we could have conversations about editing and, how stories are sculpted, and try to help explain the trust that they were going to be placing in us, to be responsible conveyors of their story. And one of the things, Will and I both remember this so clearly from early on when we first met with the Uru-Eu-Wau, before we even really were doing much filming. We were there for a meeting, and the Uru-Eu-Wau make decisions by consensus. So a representative of each of the 6 villages has to come together and agree unanimously before anything can move forwards. And there was a linguist who had come from UC Berkeley who was there to try to help write down their language, which is Tupi Kawahiba. It's a language spoken by something in the low thousands of people left on Earth. And he said, look, I can help write down your language. It can be taught in schools, preserved. And the elders sat, discussed, and came back and said, we're really not into this because we know what happens when people like you come in and write down our knowledge. We're going to have to pay to speak our language, and we're not interested in that at all. And
I think this idea of ownership, he would own their language and they would have to pay him just to talk. And
that was this really important realization that like so much had been taken from this community by people who looked, behaved culturally like us, had the same accents as us, more similar clothes as us. And so, as Will's saying, on the flip side, this idea of ownership and narrative autonomy, not just in financial terms or whatever, but in many different senses, was going to be super important. And so that kind of set the stage for us thinking about this in a participatory way. Independent of that, we saw Bitete as this young leader harnessing the power of media himself. All the equipment you see arriving in the film, the drones, the GPS, the walkie-talkies, is equipment that Bitete brought himself to the community. And so we were using cameras ourselves for these artistic purposes, trying to tell a story about the community and the history of the Amazon, and Bitete is using it for this really evidentiary purpose, hard proof. And so those two things, I think, really came together in this beautiful way when COVID arrived. And we said, we're not allowed to be in your territory anymore. How can we proceed? And Bitete and the community came back very clearly with, send us better cameras, send us better audio equipment, and like we can take over the production from
and
here.
Don't worry about shot list. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't even send us a shot list. Like, we've got better ideas than you anyways. And so then it moved from participatory into a real co-production. And we didn't envision it as a co-production to start. We didn't have a contract or whatever. But at that point we said, look, you guys are producing, managing footage for huge scenes, chunks, arcs of the film. So we need to treat you guys like we would treat any other creative production company on the film. Get a logo at the top, you get an equal cut of the profits of the film as any other production company. We're going to involve you guys in business decisions as well as creative decisions from here on out. But it was a pretty natural evolution to get to that point, I think. It was sort of thinking about the next challenge in front of us and trying to address that as it came.
It sort of leads to the question, at what point did you get releases from the individuals themselves, because it's very anxiety provoking to do a lot of filming when you don't have something written down. And yet a bunch of recent filmmakers have gotten toasted for seemingly exploiting or putting the lives of their participants in danger. So, given the trust you're trying to build with them, how did you navigate the legal issue of wanting to have a written agreement?
It varied dramatically depending, with the farmer invaders. As soon as I shot anything with them, I was like, we need to get a release, because who knows if I'm ever going to see you again, if this relationship is, I felt like, I could get cut off from them at any moment. And so I wanted to get releases pretty quickly. We got releases with Nadinia, everybody, major characters very early on. We then did better releases towards the end. And then, part of it, you see somebody in the background or whatever, and you have to go back and say, oh my gosh, let's go talk to this person, and show them the film and whatever. But yeah, Will, do you have more nuance to that answer? I just feel like it varied a lot.
No, it varied a lot. And it was, I'm just also seeing a question in the chat about how, the co-production on the one side affected the relationship with the farmers. And I just kind of want to make it really clear that we took two different approaches to the two different sides. We did not treat them as equals. And I think that went against a lot of our journalistic instincts. And I think a lot of the kind of old school rules about the relationship between, about a journalist and their subjects. And in many ways, our film had kind of didn't take that entirely. We have a co-production with one one side of the participants in the film and not with the other. And to me, I just want to make the point that there is no one size fits all. We've been part of a lot of conversations about what's an appropriate non-extractive way to work with participants. And I think that it really comes down to understanding the context of power and understanding the historical context and the power dynamics between the film team and the participants, between the participants and their world and the story. And if there are multiple participants in conflict with each other, understanding the power dynamics that they have against each other. Because for us, what was really clear was that there was so much, as Alex had mentioned with that story about the linguist, there was so much had been extracted from them, stolen from them, that it was totally important for us to have a more power sharing. We had to give up power to them and have checks and balances and have a more open working relationship with the indigenous community because of the historical theft and because they were the oppressed in this particular story. And the far right, farmer settlers had the backing tacitly of the government. They, population-wise, are much bigger. They have more money. They have more resources. And we made the decision to take a much more conventional journalistic approach with them, where we were very clear with them. We had a kind of social contract about how we would treat their story in an observational way. No one would be speaking for them. We would be spending a lot of time and doing our best to empathetically show their point of view, but they weren't going to have oversight in this process. They weren't going to be producers. They weren't going to have business decisions. They weren't going to have decisions over the final cut. We were telling them that we were filming with all sides. We were very straightforward and clear, but we had a completely different working agreement with the indigenous community where they did have oversight and power over a lot of the decisions, creatively, business-wise, and just in everything. They became production partners. And so for me, it's a tough thing. I think the film, we tried, our kind of principle is be honest with the audience and make that clear in the synopsis, make that clear in everywhere the film is written about. And, you see their logo at the front. And so, it's a tough thing to balance. And I don't know how much you can necessarily copy paste from any one project onto another, but I do feel like, if anything, it's a mark of how customized each relationship has to be. We had to take two completely different approaches in one film.
Did you show them scenes, or did what your first rough cut, was that when they first saw what you're doing with it? Or talk about the process of getting their creative input.
Yeah, I really didn't want anybody to be shocked by the final film. That was like the main thing. I didn't want to show the film and have somebody like, whoa, this is what I thought we were making. And so just verbally, we were very open with Bitate and Nadinia. Hey, this is, you're an 18-year-old kid. Here's how a lot of like hero's journey arcs shape up in film. Here, like, this is how I kind of see your life going right now. These are the decisions in front of you. Depending on which one you make, like, of course, it changes the course of the film. And just being pretty open, he sees what we're filming. He sees what we're interested in asking questions about during interviews. And so just talked through with him, like, what we were filming and how we were seeing their story. And they gave us, deep trust in terms of the editing process and said, we don't want to see anything until you feel pretty confident in it. And so that meant showing, pretty late rough cut to Bitate and Nadinia, and they had some minor notes, which were actually really good and helpful in terms of understanding it from their perspective. And for Sergio, I showed him all the scenes that involved the association of Rio Bonito once they were edited. And I didn't want to show him the entire film before it was ready, but showed him everything that involves himself. And he was like, cool, this is a good representation of who I am in the world. Like, go tell everybody. And Martin's, the kind of renegade we're not in touch with anymore. He's just off on some new frontier somewhere.
One of the biggest challenges in terms of setting the direction was around the death of Ari. So if anyone hasn't seen the film, Ari was this beloved leader of the surveillance team and is also a school teacher and father and just a very kind of cornerstone of the community, loved guy. And he was targeted and murdered. And the Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau have a very particular tradition around when someone passes. They have a funeral and they bury the person with all of their earthly belongings, and they no longer say that and they get out, they mourn, and then they are done. They don't speak the person's name. They don't see images of that person. When you speak of them, you say, the deceased. There's like kind of ways around mentioning their name or seeing them. And it was really unclear at first, how we'd been shooting. We had footage of him, how they were going to want to handle it. So we were very, we were giving them, all the power to take their time, and we weren't pushing. We assumed that we couldn't tell that part of the story just because of that tradition, but they made the decision to go out and fight for justice publicly and make advocacy. And so in the film, you see them put out huge billboards all around their region with Ari's face. Who killed Ari Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau? And they did, protests in front of the state legislature where they spilled blood on the steps, and they were out chanting his name and saying it loud and proud a lot, breaking their own rule, but as an homage to try to make sure that he didn't die in vain and to fight for justice, because for over 2 years, no one had even been arrested. It was kind of a sham trial happening right now. Someone else who was already in prison. And so that fight for justice dovetailed into conversations around how we would treat it in the film. And they wanted it in the film. They wanted it in the film, but they didn't want to see it. It was a really interesting challenge for us because they said, it's too painful for us to deal with it, but please go, make this part of our call for justice. And so there was a tremendous amount of trust that we felt was placed with us, and that was a challenge. And they went into, everyone saw it by the end, but it was something we actually had to show them versions where we'd cut everything out. And it was a unique challenge.
It must have been very tempting to direct a little bit, but Tate, would you, be comfortable going to, here, or did you pretty much just follow what they were doing But once you, particularly once you got a sense of where the story was going, knowing you maybe needed something, how did you navigate that?
Uh, yeah, we didn't direct anything in the moment at all. You know, like what people have asked a lot about the scene with Nadinia and the kidnapping. Like, was that really audio that you got there? Did you splice in a phone call? Like, no, that was just that happens twice a year. We were there, we were rolling. All of that is sync sound. Like that's how that happened. I think we would talk with them in between scenes and car rides about the film and how it's going and all of that. And so I think it's unavoidable to a certain extent that people are aware of the camera and are trying to. There are parts of Bitate's life that I know he didn't want us to have access to, like deep doubts that he had about himself. That I really thought would have been really interesting to explore, that self-criticism and real anxiety that he felt at different moments, and he didn't want us to see that, and that's just
I
because
actually think it's there, though. I mean,
I hope there's a little bit.
What's that?
I hope there's a little bit. Yeah,
Yeah.
we did try to get some of that in there, but
Yeah.
no, we didn't really direct people in the moment. There wasn't like sit here, stand here, the light's better, whatever.
No, I know that. I just meant like planting ideas of what they might want, what you might want a scene of, for instance, or
Well,
Yeah,
we
so
knew
a
certain
good
things.
example.
But
Well, I'll just like the example of like the conversation with Bitate and his grandfather. That's an example of like we had shot that scene. It felt really great. Then had this idea, okay, let's turn this into a deeper scene where there's a reflection memory built into it. And so, the conversation didn't include a lot of the stuff that was then said narrating that memory. And so once we had that scene, we went back and I did an audio only interview with his grandfather, really asking just about that story of first contact, what that was like, and building that out audio only so that we could build it into that conversation, but in a more subjective way. And so I think that's maybe like, we would be kind of, when we found holes in the story somewhere, we would kind of go in and try to get what we could in a, strictly nonfiction way, but to fill those in.
right.
But I think the co-production thing, this is where being totally transparent about the way that it is different than a traditional journalism approach is, we had shot, I don't know how many surveillance missions where we go out with cameras and their whole surveillance team, and they go out looking for invaders. And then when COVID happened, they were shooting that all themselves. And so we would send essentially assignments, and we were paying day rates to cinematographers if they were sort of shooting for the film. And we had a whole agreement as part of our co-production about who owns the footage, who owns the cameras, and it was all co-owned. We had, it was a whole arrangement, and we had assignments where like Alex would direct Tanguy, the cinematographer, try to get these types of shots, try to get some cutaways, hold it on Vita's face, like just sending notes as you would to a cinematographer. And the camera passes fluidly from people's hands. And so in a sense, like the people who are in the film are also receiving some direction. And there was something that we included in the film. I don't know if you guys picked up on it, but when they're about to head out from COVID happens, they're getting ready to go out back into the forest, and Bitate goes to interview, or maybe it was Tanguy goes to interview another person. Her name is Tejubi, and he asks her a question, and then he kind of interrupts her and says, no, look this way.
Yes.
And that was because of some stupid, we were doing these workshops and we were doing these things where we were sending via WhatsApp. We hired a Brazilian cinematographer who was a close friend to create a whole bunch of WhatsAppable workshops with these little videos, and we'd send them as these little mini pieces of curriculum. And somewhere in there was kind of, rule of thirds and like eye line in the sort of documentary 101. And it's like, don't look directly down the barrel of the lens, look a little bit off. And it was like a perfectly fine shot. and it was
way better,
organic, and then they like ruined it.
Yeah.
And it was because of our stupid directing. And so I think we include that in the film partly as a nod to how we had to we had to stop our own instinct to have our own hand in their shooting because it was making it worse, and their own cinematography instincts, like Tangai's instincts, and how he's able to move through the forest, how he's able to capture the surveillance mission that he just understands on a completely different level than we could, made the footage so much better. And those are the surveillance missions that end up in the film, because they're just better shot and more raw and more, you're in it way more than the stuff that we had done. And so I think, the directing stuff, like how much was directed, it was sort of this balance, because with the co-production and with them shooting, you have to direct a little bit, but we were navigating that.
But I will say, like, we weren't directing. I think like none of the cinematographers appear in the film. Like that was one line we had. You can't be a character in the film and be a cinematographer. Bitate shoots a couple things himself, but for the most part, like if you're on the film team, you're then also not in the film. It's the same with the executive producers from the Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau community. You can't be like a personality in the film and also be part of the crew. And that was one of the lines that we had to make for ourselves.
And none of those trips were like things that were produced for the film. Those were things that were happening, and then we were just figuring out how to react to them. So in that way, it's pretty normal.
I still have a ton of questions, but I really want to leave time for everybody else. And there's a bunch of really great questions in the chat, like Jamie just posted, and a couple others. And so when we get to the questions, you folks who just put those questions in the chat, I hope you'll use the hands up function and come on camera and ask them. But just a few more, and they'll just be in a few minutes. So I want to get to the funding and like what you did to complete the film. At what point did you get the bulk of the funding? You got maybe some production funding from Darren Aronofsky's company, enough to maybe no? Just good advice. And
this is also a long story, so you can cut me off, please. But no, we were scrappy dog funding through grants for the vast bulk of it, and only raised the bulk of the finishing funds at a rough cut stage and later, even though we had conversations that took a while. So basically the journey was, at the very first, we had one sort of angel grant that was $25,000 that got us started from a friend's dad who set us up with a dinner with a local wealthy lady in our town. And that got us started. And then we just hustled on grants. We raised over $500,000 in grants by the end of it, from just well over 100 applications, just absolutely going everywhere we possibly could. And we did well with industry grants. So we got grant from Catapult, from Sundance, from the IDA Enterprise Grant, and the Doc Society Climate Story Fund. Those were all fantastic. That happened over the course of years. And we also went out to environmentalist money. So we raised some money from money that wasn't really for film, but would have otherwise been for forest protection and climate stuff. We did crowdfunding, friends and family, Christmas fundraiser sort of thing. And that took us, for the first year or two. And we were both working filmmakers on other people's work to pay our own way through it. And so, shooting on other people's films, I was editing on other people's films. And then, we at a certain point recognized that the film was too ambitious and too expensive to make with grants. And so we also needed to go out to investment financing. And so we lined up, a few deals fell through. COVID was totally confusing for everybody, but eventually we had 3 financing partners who we kind of said, if you guys will all go in together, jump all together, then we can almost finish the budget. We'll be able to finish the film. And so that was, Sigrid's company, Time Studios, and this outfit called Luminate, this foundation. And there is just like a story of there. Illuminate was like our biggest single funder came from a cold LinkedIn message. Like we were just scattershot trying to raise money everywhere we could. Going, as I said,
I would cruise through like the credits of, you know, Jeff Orlowski's films and be like, okay, he must know rich environmental people. Like, let's look up this last name. All right, let's look him up here.
We made a list of everyone who was credited as an EP on any environmental documentary in the past 20 years and just cold emailed them.
And that was your like pitch, was the environmental aspect, save the rainforest angle? Or
well, this was one of the things, you know, frankly, that was so it was kind of a challenge, but it was it was kind of it's just part of the work was being able to figure out how to pitch this film very differently while still staying true to it, depending on who we were pitching it to. The conversations around for some funders, it really was about the co-production. It was really about indigenous story sovereignty. For other funders, it was about protecting the Amazon. For other funders, it was about cinema. It was about selling the film and having a nice fat return. And so we had to make it commercial feeling while still telling them about exactly the same project. And so we just,
But I will say we didn't let those funder decisions dictate the story. We weren't, we knew what we wanted to do, which was to make a commercially viable film that could be seen by a lot of people, that had, a sort of, not radical politics, but a different ethos at its core about the way films are made and the message of the film. And we also wanted it to feel cinematic and be something that you'd be proud to show in a theater.
We were very clear to everybody that we didn't want to give up any rights. We saw this as something where we would want to hold complete creative control until the end and sell it out of an A-list festival to a streamer, because that's where we saw that there would be the money that we would need to make it at the level that we wanted to make it.
Yeah, your timing was good. I'd say you got it in the nick of time, given where things are at now. Sigrid, you're back. Okay, good.
I'm back. And I could say why I joined the team.
Yeah, please do.
What was about these two young filmmakers. I meet a lot of them, and there's a lot of films out about the Amazon or people wanting to make films about the Amazon. So in the beginning, I wasn't really that interested, just to be like completely honest, not because, I'm not interested in producing films. I definitely am. But just because there was a lot of tick boxes that were harder, but I got to see some of the material and I was just blown away by the filmmaking. I mean, the Alex's talent is huge. I can say it, Alex, you can't, but I can say it. And the material was just so strong. And it just touched upon fiction films that I loved, Thin Red Line, and a lot of the way Alex is creeping around in nature and filming people, running, and I was in love with the whole aspect of the little and the big, and the ants that were carrying like big leaves on the back, and there was just so many elements that I felt were stuff where I could also see I could work as a producer and help actually make a better film. And that's really important for me to join a film. It's not just about the money, and it's not just about loving the team and the filmmakers, but it's also about, do you actually see yourself, even you're a more experienced producer, do you see yourself actually actively being able to participate in creating a better film? And the potential was there. Like, there was no doubt the potential was there. There were some elements, like there wasn't, of course, budgeted enough sound, because sound is maybe the new world for these two young filmmakers, that the sound can do so much for a film. And I think that was definitely one of the points where I could help out and get people engaged, and also very experienced sound designers to get them engaged, etc. So there has to be some personal connection too.
I understand the sound person worked for like 6 weeks gathering sounds in the area, in the forest.
I'm not sure how long. I don't think she was there for 6 weeks. That's the composer you're talking about.
Composer, okay.
Maybe Alex can tell a little bit about how the composer collaboration got started, because she's such an incredible, talented composer, woman from Kyrgyzstan. I fell for that too. I thought that was amazing. Like, how can we have a female composer from Kyrgyzstan on this film? And Alex, maybe you can tell a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. Katya Mikhailova, our composer, I had worked together with her on a short film prior that was actually set in Kyrgyzstan. And she has this really creative, curious, very open approach to scoring films. And so we began talking really, really early, while we were still shooting, and decided that it would be best if she could actually come to Brazil and record the sounds of the forest, of the frontier, of all these different environments, and try to use them instrumentally in the score. We wanted to build something that felt like it was not imposed on the film externally, but kind of built organically from the ground up in this environment in which the film takes place. And so she brought a contact microphone that she put on this beautiful old tree as some illegal loggers were cutting it down, and got this, hollow, eerie, splintering sound. The sound of an Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau bow and arrow releasing becomes a rhythmic element in Bitate's score. It was so interesting for me to just travel with her through these places that I'd been so often. Some of them I'd be like, God, it's such a boring environment. But she would be like, stop the car. And we'd get out and she would play a fence post or something. Like, everything was sensed in a really different way through her. And then that collaboration with the sound design team in Copenhagen, which Sigrid introduced us to, became something that we spent a lot of time on, trying to weave the sound design with the score, with the ambiences, trying to make the forest feel like home, have it feel inviting, rather than a sort of aggressive place like it often, layer upon layer upon layer of sound in many kind of nature documentaries. And so, yeah, a lot of love went into that whole process.
We've been meaning for a while to do a talk here on one of our Fridays about the director and composer relationship.
Oh,
how do you decide how much music to use? I mean, some particularly when, some composers and some filmmakers love to have big scores. It certainly gives it a cinematic feel. How much is too much, do you feel, in a documentary?
I think I will always err on too much and then have to pull it away, because I love music. I think it's fun to edit to music. And when you're working with somebody who can just build something that's even like the hatchling of an idea in your mind, that my tendency is to kind of overdo it and then have to reel it back a lot in the mix.
Were you cutting to temp, or did she have music early on for you?
Yeah, we cut to temp. She had music early on, temp music from other films. We would build little, some things we spent a week in Copenhagen sound mixing, and then I went back and re-edited an entire scene to match the mix, because I was like, wow, the fire scene in the film, there had been some talking in it, there had been a couple moments, so to speak, and then we found a way through their sound design to tell that whole story with no speaking for 3 minutes, I think it is, or something like that. And yeah, it was a really kind of back and forth process, I think.
But I think it's maybe interesting to mention, Alex, the combination between sound and music. I think that's really the key. It's great to talk with the composer and figure out the music, but really the soundscape is sort of the dramaturgy of the audiovisual experience of a film. I don't know how to express it other than that. And we think the images are the most important, and they are. The images are, of course, important, but it's just the experience of watching the film. It's maybe like 75 or 70% of the experience is the soundscape. And that's why working with sound designers like Peter Albrechtsen, I can point at some other really creative ones that I know, at least from my own country, Rasmus Winter, who just did Holy Spider, the Danish Academy film, the Iranian film, but he's also done a lot of documentaries. They kind of build the scape together with the composer. So very often there was also some, where Peter was asking for some specific sounds. And then Katja would be the one like, oh, I recorded an instrument in the Amazon that sounds like breathing, so it kind of became like a really collaboratory experience of sound and music.
I don't know why everybody's being shy today about using the raised hand function, but so I will.
There's a lot of questions in the chat.
I know. So I'll go into until somebody does, I'll go into the chat and do it. But I just have, oh, thanks, Juliet. I just have one last question myself before I get to the others. What did you learn on this through the process of making it that you would like do differently next time you make a film, or or would you, or you wished you had done differently on this one, maybe?
I think the thing I'll take from this that, isn't intuitive to filmmaking necessarily is, as I said before, the Uru-Eu-Wau make decisions by consensus. A member of each of these 6 villages comes together, and it can take a couple of hours to discuss. It can take days. It can take weeks. Sometimes they never fully agree, and then nothing moves forwards. And spending that time engaging in that process, like film is such a hierarchical, industry in some ways. You have a director and producer who make decisions, and assistant editors and camera people who carry out those decisions for the most part. And this was a completely different horizontal structure that we were operating in. And we couldn't ask them to adapt to our film structure. We had to meet, the way that they had societally organized themselves and adapt ourselves to that. And it was slow, and it was like difficult at times. I felt like, God, we're missing so much important stuff. Like, if only we can see through to like what I can see that this film might be, then like, gosh, we're just missing so much amazing material. But what I came to understand by the end of this film is that, like, having engaged in that really slow process is what built the trust, so that when things got really difficult, when Ari was murdered, when Nadina's child was potentially kidnapped, there was so much trust that we didn't have to stop and have any conversations. There were no doubts in anybody's mind that we were all on the same page. We fully agreed about why we were doing this, what the purpose of it was, and we could just go in those moments. And so, yeah, that really long, patient, early investment, I think, is something I'll try to bring, even if I'm not working in a consensus-driven culture next.
Thanks. Okay, Juliet, take it away.
Hi guys. Wow, thank you so much for talking with us. It's really that's amazing. As a cinematographer, I'd love to know, and also Alex, I know that you also edited this, which is also something I do, filming and editing my own stuff. And I'm curious how you approached the cinematography as a human. And you just talked about this beautiful horizontal process of being with people in real time, in the present. And then also as a filmmaker, like, oh, I've got to get this shot and I'm trying to tell this story. So, and I read another interview with you where you talk about the difficulty of like watching the rainforest burn, and you're like, holy shit. So I just wondering if you could talk about that. And, even if there are shots or scenes you might miss out on, because the filmmaker part is like, oh my God, I got to get this. But the human part is like, this is not appropriate, or like, everyone's exhausted right now, I'm not going to like shove a camera in their face. I'm just curious if you could talk about that, please.
Yeah.
Good question.
Great question. It's like the consummate struggle of filming with people who you vehemently disagree with, I think, is that you're exposed to these things that are really nasty and difficult to be around. And I would go often with Paula Moura, who's an incredible radio journalist from Brazil. And we were often the team that would go and film with these invaders. And we would get really like, Paula would get physically sick sometimes because we were around, we would just have to leave and go somewhere else and like palate cleanse by spending some time with Nadinia and remembering why we're making this film, why these images are important to get. The motivation to go and begin filming with these farmers in the first place came from early conversations with Bitete and Nadinia about how they saw this film, you know, within their lives, within their society. And they felt really clearly that critically investigating the ideology that's driving these farmers to this type of destruction and violence was really important. And that it was happening in broad daylight, and it was happening with, you know, extreme impunity by this new government. And that, you know, bringing that out, making that visible was actually something that could aid their fight more than talking to the highest ranking environmental leaders or anything else. At the moment that like scene with the fire was happening, Bolsonaro was in the media saying that it was indigenous people lighting fire to the rainforest in order to undermine Brazil's national sovereignty. And so it was so emotionally difficult to film that kind of stuff, especially when, you know, you have this understanding of the forest and how precious it is and what it's doing, not just for this community and this, you know, particular ecosystem, but for everybody who wants to live on the planet. And how little time we have left, like all of this existential stuff that keeps me up at night anyways kind of boils down into those particular moments. But stepping out and being back with Nadine and Bitete and the people who are fighting against this and remembering from them why it is important to show what it is that they're up against, I think was a helpful way for me to recalibrate and kind of regain the emotional energy to go back into that really dark environment where there's a lot of destructive, violent behavior and thought. I don't know if that answers very well, but
I guess I was wondering if there were any like particular moments, like did you ever stop filming, or like the way you explained it is sort of in a larger, I'm curious for a more specific example that could maybe illustrate and maybe even in the reverse direction in terms of a lot of documentary now is, I feel like, so scripted in terms of, did you have a sense of what you wanted the story to be versus what was actually happening in the moment? And you're like editing in your head and like, okay, I need this shot and then that shot, you know, and yeah.
The best example of when we really just could not film was around Ari's death. So all the footage that was shot of the funeral was shot by the Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau. It would have been totally inappropriate for one of us to have been there for that. And then even, it's a criticism of the film in some ways. Some people look at the film, they're like, gosh, you're just experiencing Ari's death through Nadinia, you know, this non-indigenous person. Like, we need to be with Ari and the Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau, we need to be with Bitete and see how he's processing this. And that just felt totally inappropriate. Bitete was grieving in a really deep way. They don't talk about the dead once they've died. And it was just a straight up respect thing. He was like, no, I'm not processing this with you guys and with your cameras. I'm processing this with my community by ourselves. And he doesn't want to talk about Ari. You know, the statement that comes right after Ari's death, what happened to him was a huge loss. We're remembering him and honoring him by defending his land, was as much as we felt comfortable asking him about that. You know, we asked a couple other questions. It was a really clear no, and we chose to respect that.
And he still feels it's hard when he watches the film. I mean, that's just so not their culture. And so it is really hard for them still.
Awesome, thank you.
Whoops, I muted myself there before we go on to the next question. I just want to make sure everybody understands. Normally, we stop our recordings when we go to the questions just to give people more latitude and privacy in case they're making personal references or anything. But the nature of this conversation is such that we're going to keep the recording going. So folks asking questions, just understand that it'll be part of the recording and ultimately the video that goes up on our D-Word YouTube channel. So be aware of that. Lila.
I think
No,
you're muted.
You're muted, Lila. There you go.
How about now? Can you hear me?
You're good.
Okay. Juliet kind of stole my thunder there with the last question. I was very curious about the same. However, it kind of leads into my other question, which was about how you learned or arrived at participatory filmmaking in the first place. I'm just honestly so thankful that filmmakers who were using this process went and captured this story, and because it's such a different holistic kind of way of making films that I try and do as well, but I'm just curious how you all arrived at that as a process in general.
I mean, it goes way back to like even our childhood of how we used to make funny little mockumentaries and things. But we, as Alex mentioned, both studied environmental science, and we both had this interest and sort of skill set with cameras that we brought with us in that. And so, like one of all along, we were coming up with programs that were kind of how to use cameras for training purposes, and also getting people to, it was a mix of self-expression and the power of the camera as evidence. We're sort of digital babies. We came up with the internet and the proliferation of cameras and phones and everything. And so, I worked in the human rights world for a while, and I used to work at Human Rights Watch. And a lot of what we did was training human rights defenders and lawyers and people like legal defenders to do trauma-informed interviewing for case building for human rights cases. Alex had done this project with children who had experienced a sort of environmental catastrophe in the Philippines, and knows how to process that trauma through creativity, through photography and through images, and through doing these video slideshows and storytelling. And we've done a bunch of we were both kind of adjunct at the East African Film Academy when we were both based in Nairobi. And, both of us came to filmmaking sideways, and we were always interested in sharing that. And I think it was just something that we really enjoyed, frankly. And so we always had, when we had a little production company, one of the things we always said we offered was workshops. And we just always really enjoyed doing that. And that included academics, that included kids. It was everything from artistry to evidence, and it was just part of our practice before we got into feature films.
And I also think it's important to note that there's a long tradition of participatory filmmaking, especially in Brazil and in Latin America. We are not the first people to begin doing this. They're, the third cinema movement in Latin America. There's a program called Video nas Aldeias that has been around since the 1980s, working with indigenous communities to do filmmaking workshops and co-create films in this way. And so we are a part of that legacy in some ways. I think Will and I both sort of feel like that there's so many different types of films you can make. Investigative documentaries where you're, punching up against powers greater than yourself. And the type of filmmaking I'm really interested in feels like an exchange, feels like a sharing and an exchange between filmmaker and a subject or a participant or whatever you want to call it. And so that's just kind of the way that I think I'm interested in making work.
I just want to take the opportunity to also shout out that it's so cool that the media team that got formed to sort of work with us on this film is really excited to keep carrying this forward as part of the impact campaign of the film. Together with the community, we're building a cultural center, which will also kind of house a multimedia production hub within it. So we'll have more cameras, more editing computers, a podcasting studio, kind of projection space. And so we're really looking forward to seeing where they take it. Bitate is studying journalism now. He's the first person to go to university from the community, and he's studying journalism only because there's no film program. And so we're looking forward to seeing films they make. And I just think it's a really cool thing.
But it's a very good question because, I think I'm a European, I'm a Dane, and have been in this documentary business for 22 years. And when we started, we had to do it in collaboration with our subjects. Like there was no way I could have done the Mr. Big, the monastery without his consent and without actually collaborating with him. So when I started embarking in the American industry, that's when I heard the first time, oh, did you get the life rights? And I was like, the life rights? What is that? How can you get life rights to other people? Like, to me, that just sounded like documentary film became this commercial money machine of like getting people's life rights. And it was like, that does not happen in Denmark. Like, are you kidding me? Like I don't even know how I should ever talk with a character or a subject or participant about getting their life rights. So I think I did a film called The Good Life, and that became a theater play. And, that came in a collaboration with them, and we didn't get any money out of it. It was just like the money was given to her. She was a very poor woman and she had no money and she had nothing. So I think I'm so happy the conversation is so lively this year about the collaboration with subjects. But, Ulrich Seidel, who is one of our most profound documentary filmmakers in Europe from Austria. If you've never seen an Ulrich Seidel film, go watch them. They're like crazy. But he always pays his subjects. Like it's a contract, and they're treated not like actors, but they're treated like they're part of the whole filmmaking process. And they're also being paid and recognized for the time that they're actually spending on the film. And so I think in a way it's kind of new that it's so interesting to some parts of the community. There's probably more Europeans here on this call, but I'm so happy that we are talking about it, because it keeps being a very, very important discussion.
Ethan, your
turn. So I was wondering, at one point, the indigenous people were saying, we really need to get some footage of what's actually going on with the invasions. And I was thinking, oh, gee, well, the filmmakers actually have that footage. So I don't know the chronology of that, but were you at one point considering whether you should include your own footage that you had shot as evidence for them, and how much that might compromise the actual production?
Ooh, what a good question. Oof.
That's a really good question. We had very strict upfront agreements with everybody that we were not going to give away locations or information about the different sides of the story with each other. And so when I would go film with the invaders, would tell Bita and Adinia, look, I'm going black for 2 weeks. You can't know where I am for everybody's security. And we would have a focal point who communications would happen through. So I would call somebody, tell them where I was, tell them what I was doing. Somebody else who's filming with Bita would call this same person, and they would decide what information gets passed between the different sides. And then when we had scenes, that there's, we didn't pass that kind of information.
We made it extremely high priority to not create conflict or add to the conflict by our presence. Yeah. And there were times where we knew more than anyone else. We knew that we were on both sides of sometimes the same operation on both sides. And we thought that we knew there's a possibility they might actually encounter themselves organically. That's part of the reason why we were there. But we really, really, really did not want anyone to know who we were with. And so we had very strict protocols around security. We had all sorts of weird code names and encrypted information channels. And we took that stuff really seriously. We'd done some work in conflict zones. We kind of just took the protocols and applied them and tried really to have a firewall. And that was a huge concern.
Simon?
Right, that's basically answered my question. What I was going to ask was, obviously you filmed with the indigenous people and the human rights activists and the loggers. Did they know that you were filming the other side? How did they feel about it? That was my question. So did they actually know that you were filming the other side?
They knew that we were filming with all sides. We didn't tell them specifically with who. So they wouldn't know names, they wouldn't know locations. And it was really important But we told them that we were filming with everyone, and that was part of the deal from the get-go.
In many ways, oh, sorry, I think you're muted, Simon.
Yeah. Could I follow with another question, or do you want to continue?
Simon, I'm sorry, we just have 3 people left and very little time. So.
Okay, then consequences. What consequences have there been on both sides? After the release of the film, was there like hate mail for the loggers or any support for the indigenous people, for example?
Oh yeah, for the Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau, I think this film has put them on the map. There are 350 unique ethnic indigenous communities in Brazil, and the Uru-Eu-Wau are one of the smallest, and did not have a huge public platform prior to this film, and now they are obviously internationally, as you see on this call, but certainly within Brazil, there are more people focused and much more attention on their territory. I think the election and Bolsonaro's outing will do so much more to affect these farmers than the film has.
Okay, that's good.
Joel, your turn. You're muted, of course. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, thank you so much. D-World is a place to be all the time. Thank you so much for the great content that you produce all the time. I'm really super excited about the territory. It speaks to me a lot. We also have a campaign of 6 million trees in Uganda for the next 3 years with a very big team of my friends. But I'm also super excited knowing about the equipment, and that's where my question is. I would like to know about the sound, because sound is such a trick. Please let us know about the equipment used in sound. Otherwise, big up to the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to hear more about the 6,000 trees campaign too, but maybe that's another time. We had onboard shotgun microphones on, the camera I was filming with, FX6 and FX9, started out with an FS7 and like a Sennheiser
Emmy 8060.
8060, yep. And then with the Uru-Eu-Wau on their cameras, we specifically got Sony cameras for them as well, so they could shoot an S-Log3. It would color match with ours. And we would always be talking to Bitate during production about like, Bita, he's 18 years old. He's like, I don't want a microphone on me all the time, guys. It's so annoying. Like, no, when you wake up and only after you brush your teeth, like keep the microphone on, please, Bitate. And so then when it came time for them to film, he was like, all right, Alex, you guys have been harping on me about the importance of the microphones. Don't skimp on the microphones for us. Like, we know how important this is. And so he's like, we want the same shit you guys have. So we got cameras that have 2 XLR inputs for them, had a Deity, I can't remember the model name, but a moisture resistant shotgun microphone that would go directly into camera, and then Sennheiser G4 wireless lav packs with Coast 11D microphones for the Uru-Eu-Wau as well.
And Katja, you need to talk about Katja's compact phone.
And Katja had, she had a Sennheiser, I can't remember the name of it. She had a hydrophone, she had a contact microphone, that gets noises through objects. And then she had just a very nice stereo Sennheiser mic as well.
All right. Thanks for the question, Joel. Good luck with your trees and campaign. Steve and then Dylan. Dylan or Dylan? Okay.
Thanks to the team. This has been super interesting. So I also kind of work in that sphere where documentary and journalism clash or meet. And so I was interested in Will's comments about your journalistic background and specifically, what was the situation or action you took that most kind of like rankled, or did your knee-jerk reaction where, hey, in journalism, we would not do it this way, this breaks the traditional rules, and kind of whatever that situation was, how did you think about it to think, hey, we're going to do this right this way, though it might not have been considered right if we thought about it in the old way?
I just think that it was a completely unusual approach with the Uru-Eu-Wau-Wau, where, you know, we didn't provide any of the other gear. Like, we didn't provide the drones or the GPS or the little photo cameras that they'd been using on their missions, but we brought them, you know, these nicer cinema cameras, and we were talking to them about what we were hoping they would capture on the, we were thinking ahead, okay, you guys are going to go on this mission. What are some of the, you know, things we think might happen? Who's going? Okay, if you're on the boat, make sure the camera's with Bitate on his boat so that we can be following him. Like, just those conversations, those aren't things that journalists would typically do. And so I think,
I mean, yeah, all of it. Like,
yeah,
you wouldn't show scenes to people in journalism.
Yeah.
You wouldn't, yeah.
And all the way back in the way that was reciprocated, they were empowered to tell us, you know, and direct things and produce those things, partly because we weren't there, and partly because we were just sharing decision making. And so it's consultative in a completely non-journalistic way.
And final question, Dylan.
Hi, yeah, you got it right the first time. It's Dylan. Thanks. Almost no one gets that right. But thank you so much for everything so far. I just had a quick question. I found it kind of interesting that in the development stage, both of you envisioned the end of this story ending on a much darker outcome than the way the events actually progressed. And, you know, you ended up landing on a pretty hopeful note. And so I was wondering what sort of impact you originally intended for this film, or you imagined when you began, and maybe how the reality of the actual impact might have been different than what you originally imagined.
I think things were so dark for Bitate and Nadinia in the first couple of years of Bolsonaro's presidency, it felt hopeless to them. And so we absorbed that. You know, they felt like they didn't know their country anymore, like things that I understood as an American, you know, coming out of the first 2 years of 2016, that like you're bearingless, you're out afloat, and it feels like you're kind of swimming in this abyss. And so I felt like we were doing more of bearing witness in the beginning. And then eventually understood, you know, that Bitate and this young generation really did have some inspiring ways that they were beginning to fight back, and that should be part of the story as well. And I think as we're seeing play out, like in even bigger ways with the election in Brazil, the power of narrative and the power of story and the power of the media has done wonders for Lula's campaign, and the indigenous movement is at the center of that. Not just in our film is a small example of this, but it's a huge trend across Brazil that indigenous people are picking up cameras, you know, getting involved in journalism, telling their own stories, and all of these things that have remained, you know, quietly hidden away are coming out, and it's affecting the way that the country thinks of itself.
But I think our impact goal now as well throughout next year is to take this film back to the Amazon. I mean, it's had a huge global life, and we're so grateful that it's been picked up by a major distributor. It's been played everywhere. It's just been a total joy. But at the same time, I think one thing that's really important is these streaming platforms don't really exist deep in the Amazon. And so part of our what we see as important is also to make sure the film's seen both by indigenous communities who can be inspired by the work of this community and sort of have a horizontal sharing of best practices, and it starts a conversation. When we've had these conversations, it's really inspiring. At the same time, if we want to do anything about stopping the destruction of the Amazon, I think it's really important to take it to the people who are doing that destruction and take this into communities like where Sergio and Martins live, these settler frontier towns. We have a unique tool in a film that I think empathetically deals with their perspective and tries to get at its root ideology. And so I think having conversations, or at least spaces for conversation, for people who have been sold that message that indigenous people are holding them back economically, to have a film where they're humanized, and also where they can see that they're it's poor person against poor person fighting, and hopefully create dialogue around how to do land reform that suits marginalized people better and doesn't destroy the forest, and I think addresses some of the root systemic issues of land consolidation in the frontier Amazon.
But we're also going to continue, you know, putting pressure on the politicians that are decision makers, and I don't know if Will or Alex covered this, but we actually have had a huge and still have a big impact campaign. And one of the things we succeeded with, which was due to the film, was that our indigenous community got presented to the Danish politicians at CPH Docs. That's why it's sometimes smart to do festival premieres that are not at Sundance or not like only the big ones, but sometimes smaller ones too, because maybe you can actually quicker meet with decision makers at those smaller festivals. And that happened at CPH. And actually as an outcome of that initial meeting and for them watching the film, they voted in a month ago a law in Europe where all deforested products are banned in the EU. So that's meat, soy, palm oil from Indonesia, rice, coffee. And so it's, you know, we want to make change, and we need to do it on the ground, what Will was explaining, but also we need to work with the politicians and laws in order to change the structures.